Okay, today we're going to be looking at muscles. So let's start with some basic information about muscles. Let's just do a quick review. When we talk about muscles, it's important to understand that there's three types of muscles. As you can see, we have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Let's start with skeletal muscle. By the name skeleton or skeletal, it's safe to assume that skeletal muscle is going to have attachment somewhere on the skeleton. And we have voluntary control over it. It is consciously and voluntarily controlled. So I can say, I am going to pick up this water and drink. I voluntarily and consciously contracted my biceps, my finger flexors, my wrist flexors to make that happen. If we look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, we see that it is striated. What gives skeletal muscle its striations are these protein filaments. We have contractile protein filaments like actin and myosin, and the way the light shines through these thin and thick filaments through a microscope, it gives it a very striated type of appearance, almost like looking at like Venetian blinds or something, right? How light can shine through and it looks like light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. That's what skeletal muscle appears. It is striated. Now, so is cardiac muscle is also striated. But the difference between skeletal and cardiac is that skeletal is voluntary, whereas cardiac muscle is involuntary. You can't contract your right atrium or right ventricle or left atrium and left ventricle as you can your biceps or triceps instantaneously. One of the other differences between cardiac and skeletal is that skeletal is not only striated, but it's multinucleated, and cardiac muscle is striated and uninucleated, right? Here we see many, many nuclei, but you can see in each myocyte, there's just one uninucleated, one nucleus in each fiber, but it is also highly branched. If you look, you see that they have many branches, unlike skeletal muscle. So cardiac muscle relates to the heart, skeletal muscle relates to muscles that attach to the skeleton. Skeletal muscle is voluntary and striated. Cardiac muscle is involuntary, but also striated. You can't voluntarily and instantaneously make your heart beat 90 beats per minute right now if it's been 72 beats per minute. It just won't do that, okay, not voluntarily. Smooth muscle, all the way on the left-hand side, smooth muscle, these are more spindle-shaped and they are non-striated, also uninucleated. And these are found in the walls of internal organs. So we can find this in the intestines, small intestine, the colon, also known as the large intestine, the stomach, the esophagus. You can also find smooth muscle around your trachea, your windpipe. Your windpipe or trachea can constrict or dilate. Your arteries, right, your blood vessels, they can vasoconstrict or vasodilate. Vaso means vessel. So when your vessels vasoconstrict, your blood pressure goes up. And if they vasodilate and open up, your blood pressure goes down. So smooth muscle is involuntary and it's smooth, it is not striated. Cardiac and skeletal are both striated, but cardiac is involuntary, much like smooth muscle, whereas skeletal is voluntary. So we have three different types of muscle. When we look at skeletal muscle, what's going to make skeletal muscle contract is the interaction of what happens in a sarcomere, where we have actin and myosin interacting with one another. So you're going to have to review the neuromuscular junction and understand what takes place where a neuron and a muscle make contact. That's called the NMJ, or the neuromuscular junction. What we're looking at here in this illustration, in this picture, we can see that, oh, let me go back one second because I do want to show you something. If you look at cardiac muscle, one of the things I forgot to point out was that we have these intercalated discs, right? These black vertical lines. They run transversely to the muscle fibers. And what these intercalated discs are is the junction or union between two cardiomyocytes. Where they come together is an intercalated disc. And if we were to separate them and look inside, in each of these little crevices or valleys are gap junctions. Remember, gap junctions bring cells together, and they're used for very rapid forms of communication. And we know that one heart cell and another heart cell have to communicate with each other super fast so that every heart cell in the right atrium contracts at the same time. And the left atrium, for that matter, must contract. So the atriums contract, and then the ventricles contract. Atrium, ventricle, atrium, ventricle, atrium, ventricle. And it's those intercalated discs and gap junctions that make that happen. So now when we look here, we can see that we do have these intercalated discs here, here, here. You could see these lines running perpendicular to these muscle fibers. And it looks very striated, okay? So it's striated. We have intercalated discs. Intercalated discs are not seen with skeletal muscle. And it is branched, right? We could see these branches here. So what is this? These are branched cardiac muscle fibers. That's what is highlighted here. If we look here, now these are the spindle shaped, right? These are smooth muscle fibers. These are involuntary. When we look here, these, once again, these are striated. We see light and dark bands. We do not see intercalated discs at all, so we know that this is skeletal muscle. And what is being highlighted in each of these are the nuclei, or the nucleus of the skeletal muscle. That's what's being highlighted. So what structures are being highlighted? The nucleus of the skeletal muscle fiber. That's what's being highlighted. Now, here, what we're looking at is the neuromuscular junction. So this here in the red, this is the motor end plate, and this here is the axon of a motor nerve fiber. So this axon of the motor nerve fiber contacts the motor end plate and transmits its action potential to make the actin and myosin interact with one another. Now here, what is this structure that's highlighted? This again is the neuromuscular junction. What's being highlighted is the motor end plate. The motor end plate refers to the muscle itself. Where the nerve and the muscle interact is the neuromuscular junction. And in that space of the neuromuscular junction, there's a lot of magic that happens there. Okay, so you have an action potential that runs down the neuron. And as the action potential hits the end, it doesn't really contact the muscle, right? There's this little gap or this little space called the synaptic cleft. And what happens in the synaptic cleft is that the action potential comes down and it's going to release a neurotransmitter. Calcium is actually lingering around. It enters the neuron. And at the end of the neuron is the axon terminal. And in that axon terminal, or the end bulb, is where there's neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitter that is released at the neuromuscular junction is called acetylcholine, ACH. And acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. It's always an excitatory neurotransmitter. So the acetylcholine is released from the axon terminal. It's now in the synaptic cleft, this gap, this space, and the acetylcholine is going to bind to the motor end plate, to the membrane of the motor end plate. And on the motor end plate, there are these receptors, or these channels, if you would. It's a protein channel. Acetylcholine binds to this channel, and when acetylcholine binds to it, the channel opens up. Open sesame, right? So again, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. It crosses the synaptic cleft, binds to this channel. When the acetylcholine binds to the outside, let's say here, that's the key that unlocks it and opens up the door, that channel. That's the sodium channel. Sodium rushes in. And when sodium rushes in, potassium rushes out, it creates excitation or depolarization. That excitatory impulse travels down what's called the transverse tubule, or the T-tubule, and that T-tubule butts up against the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In this sarcoplasmic reticulum, it is a network that stores calcium. This sarcoplasmic reticulum then releases calcium, and the calcium is going to create some magic where the actin and myosin, where that sarcomere is, where the actin and myosin hangs out. And myosin has these myosin heads that need to interact with actin, to attach to actin. When myosin heads come up and attach to actin, it can make actin move back and forth to make it contract. But the binding sites on actin are covered. They're covered by something called tropomyosin. And troponin holds it in place. So think of tropomyosin as like this long rope, and troponin is a staple that holds that rope in place, and it blocks the binding site on actin. Well, what calcium does, calcium removes troponin. It's like a staple remover. It removes troponin. And then tropomyosin slides out of the way. When it slides out of the way, the binding site on actin is open, and then myosin can attach to it and create a contraction. So calcium is really important in making muscles contract. It's stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and when it's released, it removes troponin, so tropomyosin slides out of the way, and myosin heads can grab onto actin on the binding site. So that's a little bit of neuromuscular physiology. To understand that, just make sure you review the neuromuscular junction, and those are the sequence of events that really do take place.